Susan Toth-Cohen is going to be presenting today, and we have her colleague, Ann Smith, and Susan is Zsuzsa in Second Life from Thomas Jefferson University, and Ann is Annemaree in Second Life from Five Sparrows Counseling and Education Services, and they're going to talk about how from their inception, virtual worlds have attracted educators from many disciplines, benefits both students and educators for networking and for immersive experience. It's been well documented, but while virtual world education has engaged multiple disciplines to learn with, from, and about each other, the potential for significant innovation in interprofessional education, that's IPE, has not been fully realized. So this presentation outlines ways to revision and implement interprofessional education in virtual worlds. So I welcome our next presenters, Susan and Ann, and let me know if I can be of any help as we get our presentation set up.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation, Revisioning Interprofessional Education in Virtual Worlds. Val told you a little bit about our presentation and wanted to draw your attention to the landmark and URL giver in the front. It has our text version of our presentation, and it also has a link to a slide share. Slide 2. And so this is what Val told you about, that we've been noticing that virtual world simulations we haven't really seen much advancement in innovation there, and so thinking about it, we found that the model of flexible learning is a useful tool, and wanted to discuss that with you all. So virtual world interprofessional education simulations have some similarities with regular on-site simulations. And just as a review, interprofessional education is defined as learning with, from, and about each other. That's from the World Health Organization. And so in the presentation, we're going to outline ways to revision IPE using a flexible learning framework that you can use to develop, implement, and enhance virtual world training programs. We'll have some examples for you of what we've done. Okay, next slide. The organization of our presentation is that we're going to do an introduction, talk about the theoretical model, describe the project and the different simulations, explain the format of the training, implementation, and then lessons learned. So just going back to previous slide, if I can. Yes. Okay. Well, you know what? I don't think I need to talk more about those things. I think they're pretty intuitive. I hope so anyway. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about some of the things that we see as most applicable to. Okay, this is still going on with the previous thing that we decided is not necessarily necessary. So, wanted to talk about key affordances that we found are most relevant to interprofessional education. And so, if you're familiar with IPE, you know that it can be challenging to get people together in the same location. And so the virtual world has the advantage of not everyone needing to be geographically in the same place. Also, like other types of simulations in real life, students are enabled to practice skills in a safe environment. so that they're less hampered by fear of making mistakes, and that's a key point. Also, being able to enact simulations that could otherwise be physically or ethically impossible to simulate in real life. And so some of those are thinking about it that you really wouldn't be able to necessarily do outreach with homeless persons and interact with a person who has Alzheimer's disease and is very agitated and still be, physically safe and be able to handle the situation necessarily if it's your first time as a student. And then also, if the other affordance that we thought was important is to be able to create simulations that otherwise might be too costly. And so examples of those could be you couldn't exactly block off an entire area of the city in order to have a homelessness simulation. And you may not also be able to do a simulation with, a facility meeting somebody with Alzheimer's disease. Then the final application affordance relevant to IPE that we find important is being able to create transformative experiences by enacting through an avatar within a social environment. Because in these simulations with these underserved populations, vulnerable populations, an advantage is that the student can actually become this person in the simulation, become someone who's homeless or become a person with dementia. Okay, next slide. Let's talk now about the way we're looking at this, the lens through which we're seeing IPE simulation. And so we're really looking at the flexible learning model that was described originally by Casey and Wilson. And it goes from a movement in education that I think we're all aware of, where we're moving toward more learner-centeredness, learner control, and independence. And the model is multidimensional, encompasses teaching and learning at a distance, and also encompasses use of technology. And so the main tenet of the model is learner control, but also provides developer control and provides options to customize experiences. And that's one of the things that we really want to focus on. So let's look again now a little bit more at the actual model in the next slide. And so we're looking at a depiction of the model and looking at the overall idea. And so the flexible learning model looks at four main areas, and those are represented by the concentric circles of the institution, the implementation, pedagogy, and technology. And then within that, you also can see that there are within that 5 dimensions of flexibility. And so the 5 dimensions of flexibility are related to time, content, entry requirements or who can participate, the instructional approach and resources, and the delivery and the logistics. And so in the depiction of the components of flexibility, you can see that they can range from a very fixed time, in this case, time, content, entry requirement, instructional approach, resources, delivery, and logistics, or they can be flexible. So that in itself gives options for IPE. And so if we use the example of time, IPE experiences can be structured with fixed dates or over a time period chosen by the learners, or a combination of the two. So, for example, the students, the learners, might need to complete the simulation within a specified period, but would have flexibility and control as to when exactly they did the simulations, as is the case in one of our simulations, Enhancing Services for Homeless Populations. Okay, so in the next slide, we're going to look at the population of focus, the creation of the SIM, the flexible learning model application to IPE, and the Triad model, which is the way that we structure the simulation. So looking at the populations of focus, we have two different projects. The first one was Enhancing Services for Homeless Population. That was the first one developed. And that focuses on homelessness. And then the second, which is the lower part of the screen, focuses on persons with dementia and their caregivers, the Alzheimer's virtual interprofessional training. And so the main focus in each of these is to foster development of empathy and gain practice in communicating with people who are in vulnerable populations. This was not a highly procedural or specific skill based as far as technical skills, but more on empathy and communication. That's interesting. It seems to be coming back. Okay. So the homeless populations training, which again was the first one we developed, has three different cases that you see. We have Jeff, who's a young man with schizophrenia and substance use living on the street. He's pictured on the left. Then we have Leon, who is a 59-year-old man who lost his job and home, who couch surfs with friends and family. He also has alcoholism issues and post-traumatic stress from being in the Iraq War. And Christina, a 35-year-old mother of three, who left an abusive relationship and is homeless as a result. The simulations, all of these, are flexible in terms of how they are implemented by the students, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Now, going on to the Alzheimer's virtual interprofessional training and the cases there. The case really is one person, Bernice Jenkins, and she's seen initially in her doctor's office, provider office, for a medication review and a check after she didn't show for a previous appointment to check her blood pressure medication that was newly prescribed. And then we also see her 3 years later, the students see her 3 years later in her home. And she's in her home after being in the hospital for a fall. And so the provider is coming in for a home visit in order to look at the home setup and safety, do an environmental safety check. Okay, then moving on to slide 9, which is looking at development of the SIM and what that's about. Here's the orientation area where students go, and this is one of two key areas. We have the orientation area is where students are reintroduced to the format of the simulation. They do find out a bit about the simulation because of the consent process that they undergo. We show them what would be involved. And the orientation area also is a place where they can practice basic skills. And then we have the second area is a city, miniature portion of a city really, where students can practice additional skills, and that's where they do the actual simulation. And so in this photo, we see the orientation area. It has a discussion circle where we can talk initially to the students, links to resources, and then a 3D sim map for learner orientation. Excuse me, it also has the teleporters, which you might be able to see on the far right. Okay, slide 10 shows the city itself. That is modeled after a neighborhood in Philadelphia. And if you're at all familiar with Philadelphia, you can see the skyline there in the backdrop. And this simulation area is patterned after a neighborhood in Philadelphia that I was very familiar with. Then in the next slide, we see a homeless person's tent where he has made his home, Jeff's home, where he set up a tent in back of an abandoned factory. And that is based on, his case is based on an actual person who is part of the caseload for our community partner, Pathways to Housing, Pennsylvania. And we work very closely with them to develop the simulation and to conduct the simulation. To implement the simulation and make decisions about that. They didn't actually implement it with us. And then in the next slide, we see the community center, which is a regular old community center, but one of the distinguishing things about it is that it has a monthly clinic, medical clinic, where Leon, the older man with diabetes, goes for help to treat a pressure sore on his foot. Then finally, we see the third setting, and this is for Christina, who becomes homeless after fleeing an abusive relationship. And this is a transitional housing center for women and children. It's also patterned after a real-life transitional housing center from another community partner that we had, Families Forward, Philadelphia. And you can see that this building has facilities relevant to the service, including security, public areas, shared areas rather, kitchen, dining room, laundry, bathroom, meeting and office areas, and bedrooms. And then in the next slide, we go into looking at the way that we had students conduct their simulation, and that's the Triad model. And this is a model that Ann Smith introduced to me, and as you can see here, it's been used for decades for training across a range of human services professions. It's been used in healthcare, and as early as 1971, it's been used for counseling. And in this, the students, as provider, client, and observer, do the simulation, helper or provider. And so the profession involved, who the students represent, whether they're, say, medical students, occupational therapy students, social work students, and so forth, enact the role of the provider or helper from the standpoint of their own discipline. So, for example, if this is a nursing student, the nursing student assigned to a provider role would enact that role according to her knowledge of her own discipline. That she might be a student nurse, say, for example, at that clinic that's housed in the community center. or she might be an outreach worker volunteering with an organization, a housing first organization such as Pathways to Housing Pennsylvania, and so forth. So again, client needs and service context vary according to the profession. And so the three triad roles in this program were the helper provider, the client or homeless individual or persons with Alzheimer's disease, person with Alzheimer's disease, and then an observer in each of those simulations. In addition, the Alzheimer's simulation, the AVIT program, had a caregiver role. So there were 4 roles in that instead of 3. And then the service settings, or the locations where services are provided, consisted of on the street, which you saw with Jeff's tent, at a community center, and in the Transitional Housing Center for Women and Children. Okay, and then on the next slide, we see again, the simulation, this just depicts the simulation 1 and simulation 2 for the Alzheimer's virtual interprofessional training taking place in the provider's office and in the home. And just to note that the provider's office, that was one of the few things that I actually built, and it was patterned after my own provider. So I was in my doctor's office taking pictures, which was great fun, of course. Okay, and then going on to the second photo, that shows Mrs. Jenkins in her home. And the home was, just a note that you don't see the outside of the home, but this, I bought this on Marketplace, and it's very similar to row homes in North Philadelphia. It was just perfect, really. You get a lot on Marketplace. Not expensively either. Okay, now in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the flexible learning model and see how it can be applied to IPE training. So I'm going to show you a diagram that represents those dimensions of flexibility that we talked about: content, time, delivery and logistics, entry requirements, learning approaches and resources. Those are the 5 dimensions. And then looking at the arrow on your right, the flexibility of each in each of those dimensions is shown in the turquoise arrows that go from the center to the periphery. And that represents that as you move from the center toward the periphery, it's more flexible. And so we're comparing the enhancing services for homeless populations with the Alzheimer's virtual interprofessional training. And so you can see that the ESHP, the homelessness program, is shown in green, AVIT is shown in black. And so again, moving from most fixed or not flexible to most flexible as you go toward the periphery. And so I find this a useful tool because you can think about and analyze what might be best for a particular training and student or staff population. So thinking about, for example, time. think about, okay, well, what do we want to do as a simulation? How much time can we allot? And then as far as delivery and logistics, okay, well, you know, what's it going to take to actually do this? How are we going to need to schedule this and implement it? And then for entry requirements, again, that's who will participate. Who do we want to be in the simulation? Who are we targeting for this training? Then as far as the content, that's going to vary quite a bit according to, okay, yeah, just wanted to, it's going to vary according to whether it's ESHP, homelessness, or whether it's looking at someone who has Alzheimer's and their caregiver. And when you look at the diagram, you can also see, and again, looking at the ESHP in green, which is closer to the periphery in pretty much in all of them, really, versus AVIT, which is closer to the center, you can see that ESHP is much more flexible. So next we're going to look more in depth at the areas that we didn't talk as much about on this diagram, which is instructional approaches and resources. So the structure of this, the way that we approached it and gave resources to the students is we used Blackboard Learn, which is a common learning management system, along with Second Life, our sim center. And so the Blackboard Learn site was really dedicated to resources designed to prepare students to participate in the simulation. And so Blackboard Learn had a document that provided a biography of each client, background information such as their physical health, their psychosocial health, their family history, the main issues that they were facing, and a little bit about the situation they were in. Not super detailed. This was not it was not a scripted simulation. What we wanted students to be able to do was to really synthesize information between the biography, and then we also had these links to the videos, which really were pretty good, that were mostly from YouTube, but there were a few from other sources that showed people that were similar to the client in that simulation. And we found that these our intent was to have those be helpful for the student to be able to visualize, okay, well, how would I act? You know, what might I do? And some of the students were extremely effective in enacting the client role. Others were like, oh, you know, I've never really interacted with someone with schizophrenia and substance use issues. How do I know how to enact that character? We also included the peer-reviewed journal articles, and those journal articles were, we thought, especially helpful for the student enacting the role of the provider, to see, well, what are the best practices for working with this particular type of population. And there's, of course, so much written on that. You'd be surprised, you know, there's so much about homelessness and people with substance use issues and schizophrenia and other major mental health disorders. And the same with a lot of articles about homelessness and women and children. So that's how that really fit together, Blackboard Learn and the Second Life Sim Center. And then the basic training mode was a simulation followed by a debriefing, which is, of course, very similar to on-site simulations that you'll see. And they debriefed with faculty, and that was really focused on, sorry, the students talked about how things went and what they learned through each role. What was it like to enact the role of the client? What did you learn from that? And students would say things like, well, I never realized how important it is to convey respect. Because, when I was in that role, I didn't really feel, I felt like she was talking down to me, things like that. Now, talking a little bit about what we found in terms of our results, our outcomes. We did do pre- and post-testing of knowledge and attitudes and self-confidence, self-efficacy for the ESHP, the homelessness simulation. We also did knowledge testing for the AVIT and self-efficacy. And then we also did interviews of each. So here are some of our results. We found that the most striking was the change in self-efficacy, that this was increased significantly in the ESHP, which we did have the good fortune of having a larger population, so we could look more at significance. And we found that that was quite a good change. And this is over a 2-year period. We had 18, and then we had 15 in the second year. And so we're also completing qualitative content analysis of the pre- and post interviews for the ESHP, and we're finding that they're confirming the statistical results. I'm not going into a lot here because we do have some publications under development, so wanted to just give a little bit of a preview on this, some of the patterns we're finding. And then going on to the next slide, we see a similar pattern of improvement in confidence, self-efficacy after the simulation. And this was a smaller sample size, so we did not use statistical comparisons. But you can see the pattern of improvement in pre- and post-program scores. And this was also confirmed in preliminary qualitative findings. And so I think you can appreciate that there's a lot more to do, a lot more to study, more to find out, but we are encouraged by these initial trends. And in particular about consistency with other findings from the literature about self-efficacy and virtual and other simulations, which is very important. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned, and there are many more than this, but here are a few of the main take-home messages. And one is that we found that programs can be easily customized according to scheduling needs for different populations, and that's really learned that, and you can see that pretty clearly from looking at the flexible learning model when you compare and contrast those. And so we customized according to the content, the time, using similar instructional approaches and resources, but with different time frames, different content. And I think the time frame was a very big difference between the two programs. The homelessness program, ESHP, it took place over a 2 to 4 month period, where AVIT was completed in a 2-week time frame. And to be honest, I was very surprised that we found that the formats worked so well with that second group of the shorter time frame. I really wasn't expecting it to work. This was something suggested by another colleague, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. Don't they need to be immersed for a longer period? But we found that there were, especially the debriefings talking about what they learned from the IPE experience were quite striking. And we're confident that these formats can work with other populations of focus. Just need to kind of analyze, what do you need according to those 5 parameters of flexibility. Looking at some more challenges, definitely Second Life Voice was an area of challenge. Gee, I think we might not be alone in that, right? And that was an issue especially for the shorter AVIT program. Some students couldn't get voice to work at all, and some got it to work in the practice session, and then time of the simulation, it would not work. So it's because AVIT had 2 simulations within 2 weeks, students really had to be able to use voice right away. Yeah, right. And so we did find that we needed to go to an external program, Zoom, which is web conferencing, to provide voice. However, we also found a benefit. We found a benefit because Zoom also enabled us to easily record simulations and debriefings, and it also made it so, yes, we could have facilitators there who didn't have to be in Second Life, which is an advantage just because it's not always convenient to be in Second Life, right? So that was another advantage, hidden advantage that we found. And so those were just a few of the lessons learned. So now let's go on to talk a little bit about final comments and directions from here. So again, the benefits of short duration intensive time frame that I was just talking about, we really think that can facilitate learner efficiency and initiative. You have a designated time frame, it's short, okay, let's just do this. Time restrictions seem to motivate students to maximize the experience, and there was definitely no time for procrastination, as there was in the ESHP over a 2 to 4 month period. And they did drag it out sometimes, but sometimes, in a sense it could be good because, things happen. Students, like faculty, become sick, or they have to be involved in other things. So anyway, that was one of the things that was, I think, a take-home message. And then another was to elicit and consider suggestions from students. And one of the best was from a student who was in both of those simulations, AVIT and ESHP. And what she said is, you know what, why not pre-create the avatars? Instead of having us create our avatar account and then pick an existing SL avatar and then modify it. Even though you give us these lovely videos about how to do it, why don't you just give us the avatars? And then we can hit the ground running. It's like, okay, I'm going to try that. And I did try it. Still under development there to see. Also exploring a few more areas, such as, are there more debriefing questions related to development of empathy that we could employ, that could yield some rich results? And then another is based also on student feedback, looking into possibly other virtual platforms that can better enable students to convey their nonverbal emotional responses without the complicating aspects of, needing to trigger a bunch of different gestures. And this, to be honest, was, I think, more of an issue because we weren't able to always use voice in Second Life, because at least with voice, you can have the synchronization of your mouth with your speaking, so that gives a little bit more realistic feel. But I understand there are some development efforts to, and I don't know exactly how they work, but to transfer actual facial expressions by camera from a student into the avatar. And if anybody has any information or suggestions on how to look into that, I would really love that. So let's see. Yeah, just went over these points, making sure that we covered those. Yeah. Yeah, recreating the avatars, explore further debriefing, questions, other virtual platforms. Okay, and then here I'm more than happy to answer additional questions. There's my email. You can also track me down very easily. just Google me. Either way, you'll find me. We also wanted to acknowledge that this work was funded in part by the Jefferson Center for Interprofessional Practice and Education at Thomas Jefferson University, as well as through a 2017-18 Dean's Grant from Jefferson College of Health Professions, and with funding from the Women's Board of Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. We would also like to thank Eileen Young, one of our graduate assistants, for her valuable contributions to the literature review, for the presentation, and for our paper.